There is a deer at the edge of your yard right now, or there was one recently. And you probably did what most people do. You stopped what you were doing, you watched for a moment, and then you thought something like, she's just passing through, or she's looking for food, or she'll move on in a minute. She wasn't just passing through. She was making a decision about you. Not about your yard, not about the grass or the garden or the gap in the fence. About you, your presence, your patterns, your trustworthiness. She was standing at that invisible line between wild and not wild, and she was running a calculation so complex that wildlife researchers spent years trying to understand it before they realized it wasn't just instinct. It was judgment. She looked at your yard, she looked toward your house, and she decided something. You were there, you had no idea. That is the entire point. Welcome back to Hidden Backyard Wildlife, the channel where we sit with the small wild lives that share our yards and try to understand what they understand about the world. If you are new here, make sure you subscribe before this video is over, because what you are about to learn is going to permanently change the way you look at deer in your yard. Stay with me from beginning to end, because behavior number 6 is the one that researchers did not believe until they documented it themselves. And the final one, number 8, is the one I think will stay with you the longest. You probably think of the edge of your yard as the place where your property ends and the wild begins. The deer thinks of it as something else entirely. When a deer pauses at the edge of your yard, that long, still pause where she seems to be doing nothing, she is doing everything. She is reading the space. Not visually, not primarily, she is reading the feel of it, the soundscape, the scent map, the temperature differential between open air and the contained warmth of a human space. She stands there like someone who has placed one hand on a door and is deciding whether to push. Researchers studying white-tailed deer movement patterns have found that deer do not approach human spaces randomly. They approach from the same entry points repeatedly, often within hours of the same time of day. The edge is not incidental. It is chosen. The same spot, chosen again and again, because something about that specific threshold feels, in whatever way a deer feels things, safer than the others. If you have ever noticed that the deer in your yard always seems to come from the same corner, the same gap, the same patch of treeline, that is not coincidence. That is her reading and rereading something she has cataloged about your yard specifically. In a real sense, she has built a map of your property from the outside in. She has been updating it every time she stands at that edge, and that map includes you, your comings and goings, your lights, your sounds. She knows your yard better than you think. She knew it before she ever stepped inside it. Most people believe a deer decides whether to enter a yard based on what she sees in that moment. A person at the window, a dog barking, a car in the driveway, and those things matter, but they are not what she is primarily deciding. She already decided about you weeks ago. White-tailed deer have a form of spatial memory that wildlife biologists describe as remarkably persistent. They remember not just locations, but the emotional signature of those locations. Places that felt safe before feel safe again. Places that felt dangerous are remembered as dangerous for months, sometimes years. When a deer stands at the edge of your yard and seems to be calculating, she is partly comparing what she sees right now against what she remembers. And if she has seen you before, even once, even briefly, that data is already in her. Scientists documenting deer habituation in suburban environments have observed that deer will adjust their willingness to enter a space based on the accumulated behavior of the humans inside it over time. Not the behavior of all humans, your behavior, specifically. The next time you see a deer pause at the edge of your yard, understand that her hesitation is not because she doesn't know you. It may be because she does, and she is weighing everything she knows about you against the risk of closing the distance. You have a reputation with her, you earned it without knowing you were being watched. That is not a story about a deer. That is a story about how we are always being seen by the lives around us, and how we build trust in the small moments we don't think matter. When a deer freezes at the edge of your yard, most people assume she has sensed danger. And sometimes she has, but stillness for a deer is not one thing, it is a vocabulary. There is alert stillness, ears fully forward, weight shifted to her hindquarters, ready to vanish. There is evaluative stillness, a calmer, longer pause where the ears move independently, scanning, the body relaxed but attentive. There is communal stillness, where a deer stops because another deer in her group stopped, a kind of synchronized listening. And there is something researchers have begun to call affiliative stillness, where a deer pauses near a familiar safe space not out of vigilance but out of something that resembles ease. Researchers studying deer communication in edge habitats have found that the duration and posture of a deer's stillness carries meaningful information, both for other deer who may be watching and, in ways not fully understood, for the deer herself, as a way of processing her environment before committing to movement. If you have ever noticed that the deer in your yard seems to stand still for a long time without any obvious reason, not alert, not alarmed, just still, you may have been watching affiliative stillness. She may have stopped not because something scared her but because something didn't. Your yard in that moment was safe enough to stop moving in. Sit with that for a moment. For a prey animal whose survival depends on constant readiness to flee, choosing to be still is one of the most trusting things she can do. This one will change how you feel the next time you look out the window and find her there. Deer have a hearing range that extends far beyond human capacity, and a directional precision in their ears that allows them to isolate individual sounds within a complex environment. When a deer stands at the edge of your yard and you see her ears swiveling, sometimes independently, each one pointing a different direction, she is not just scanning for threats. She is building an acoustic map of your entire property. She can hear your television, she can hear your dishwasher, she can hear you walking across the floor inside your house, she can hear your voice, and over time she has learned what those sounds mean about where you are and whether you are likely to emerge. Scientists documenting sensory-based decision-making in ungulates have observed that deer are capable of associating specific recurring human sounds with predictable human behavior, and that this association directly influences their willingness to approach or remain in proximity to human spaces. If you have ever wondered why the deer in your yard seems unfazed by noise from inside your house but bolts the moment you open a door, it is because she already heard the door handle move before you touched it. The creak of your floors, the change in your footstep pattern. She heard you deciding to come outside before you finished deciding. In a real sense, she knows the sounds of your home. She has memorized them, not because she chose to study you, but because you are the most important variable in the safety calculation she makes every time she approaches. You would never know, that is the entire point. What you see at the edge of your yard is one deer. What is actually happening involves the entire neighborhood. White-tailed deer maintain what researchers call social range networks, overlapping home territories shared among related females in particular, where information about food, safety, and human activity is effectively passed between individuals through shared pathways, scent markings, and behavioral mimicry. When one deer in this network has a positive experience with a yard or a human, others in her group begin approaching that space too. When one deer has a frightening experience, that wariness ripples outward. Scientists studying deer movement across suburban landscapes have observed what they describe as socially transmitted site preference, where multiple deer begin using the same entry points, resting locations, and travel corridors based not on their own direct experience, but on following the behavioral cues of more experienced individuals who have already assessed those spaces. If you have ever noticed that deer seem to arrive in your yard in the same general patterns, the same route, the same times, the same corner of the fence, and then one day a deer you've never seen before shows up and does the same thing, she didn't find your yard randomly. Someone she trusted had already told her in the small ways available to it that your yard was worth approaching. Your kindness to one deer, your stillness at the window, your patience, your quietness, traveled further than you knew. It reached deer you will never see. It reached them through the one you did. This is the one researchers did not believe until they documented it themselves. For a long time, scientists understood deer decision-making at the edge of human spaces as purely survival-based, risk versus reward, food versus danger, safety versus threat. A simple calculus of a prey animal doing what prey animals do. Then researchers began noticing something that didn't fit. In long-term studies of deer behavior in suburban environments, scientists observed that deer would return to spaces they had been harmed in, spaces where they had been chased, startled, or harassed, and approach them with something that wasn't fear. It wasn't the frozen alertness of a deer that anticipated danger. It was something different, a cautious, considered approach, a hesitation that looked less like panic and more like deliberation. Researchers studying risk assessment in white-tailed deer have found that deer appear to weigh previous negative experiences against present sensory information in ways that suggest a more nuanced decision-making process than pure instinct, one that accounts for change over time, for the possibility that a previously dangerous space may have become safe. In other words, she was giving the space another chance. She was standing at the edge of your yard if your yard had ever frightened her, if something had startled her there, if a dog had barked or a door had slammed, and she was deciding whether you deserved a second look, whether the situation had changed, whether you had changed. You may not have noticed, she noticed. That is not a story about a deer doing math about survival. That is a story about the capacity to return to something that once hurt you and ask, quietly with your whole body, whether it might be different now. Sit with that for a moment. If the deer you see at the edge of your yard is a doe, she is rarely only herself. White-tailed does are fiercely, quietly devoted mothers. Fawns are hidden for the first weeks of their lives, tucked into tall grass beneath brush at the base of old trees, while their mothers move through the landscape, eating, drinking, checking, returning. A doe that stands at the edge of your yard in the spring or summer is often doing something you cannot see. She is assessing whether the space near her hidden fawn is safe. She is not standing there for herself. She is standing there for someone smaller, someone silent, someone waiting for her to come back. Researchers observing white-tailed doe behavior in suburban habitats have documented that does will approach and repeatedly reapproach the perimeter of human spaces near fawn bedding sites, monitoring those spaces for changes in human activity, predator presence, or environmental disturbance. Behavior that continues for weeks, sometimes throughout the entire fawning season. The next time you see a deer standing very still at the edge of your yard, looking not at your house but past it, looking at the tree line on the other side or the long grass beside your fence, understand that she may be measuring the distance between where she stands and where something she loves is waiting. She has been keeping track. She has been keeping track of your yard, your lights, your patterns, your sounds, because somewhere behind her, something small and spotted is counting on her to get it right. If you have ever left food out, kept your dog inside, moved quietly past the window during those weeks, she knew, she registered it, she recalculated. You were, in a small and uncelebrated way, part of how that fawn survived. This is the one I think will stay with you the longest. There are stories, documented, repeated, spread quietly among wildlife researchers and the people who submit observations to long-term deer monitoring programs of deer returning to yards after the humans who lived in them passed away. Not once, repeatedly for years. A doe that had spent a decade visiting the same yard, approaching the same back porch, receiving feed from the same pair of hands, continuing to come. After the person died, after the house was sold, after the yard changed, she would come to the edge, she would stand in the same place she had always stood, she would look toward the house. Researchers studying long-term site fidelity in white-tailed deer have observed that deer maintain attachment to specific locations with a persistence that outlasts the circumstances that created it, returning to sites associated with positive experiences even when those experiences are no longer available, sometimes for the remainder of the deer's life. She was not waiting for food. The researchers who documented this were careful not to project human grief onto what they observed, but they were also careful not to dismiss it, because what they saw, recorded, and sat with was an animal returning again and again to the place where something good had happened to her, where she had been safe, where someone had been still enough and quiet enough and patient enough that she had allowed herself to close the distance. If you have ever had a deer in your yard for years, if you have watched her seasons, her fawns, her slow approach and careful retreat, understand this: she has cataloged you. She has you somewhere in whatever passes for memory in a creature like her. And if you were ever to leave, she would come back to the edge. She would stand in her spot. She would look toward your door. In the small ways available to her, she would be looking for you. That is not a story about a deer. That is a story about what it means to have been, without ever trying, without ever knowing, someone worth returning to. I want to ask you something before you go, and I genuinely want to know. Has a deer ever stood at the edge of your yard and looked at you, actually looked at you, in a way that made you feel, just for a second, like something was passing between you? Tell me about it in the comments. The stories this hidden backyard wildlife community shares are some of the most extraordinary I read every week, and every single one of them matters. If anything in this video changed the way you think about deer in your yard, share it with someone who would understand. Thank you for being here at Hidden Backyard Wildlife. She is at the edge of a yard right now, standing still, deciding. And somewhere, without knowing it, someone has already been found trustworthy. I will see you in the next one.